The smell of garlic and fresh basil filled the air as Maria wiped down another table at Bella Vista, one of the fanciest restaurants in the heart of New York City. Her feet ached from standing for 12 straight hours, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Not when her little brother needed another surgery that insurance wouldn't fully cover. Maria had been working at Bella Vista for 8 months now, and she knew every corner of this place like the back of her hand. The restaurant was the kind of spot where business deals worth millions happened over plates of handmade pasta. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over tables covered in white linen. In the corner sat a beautiful black grand piano that cost more than most people's cars. Tonight felt different, though. There was electricity in the air, the kind that comes when something big is about to happen. The staff had been buzzing all afternoon about a special guest who was coming for dinner. Word was that Vincent Cross, the tech billionaire who'd been on every magazine cover lately, had booked the private dining room for an important meeting. Maria tried not to think about famous people or their problems. She had enough of her own to worry about. Her brother Diego was only 16, but he'd been fighting a rare heart condition since he was 12. The doctors said the new surgery could give him a normal life, but it would cost $40,000. Even with her 2 jobs and every penny she saved, Maria was still $20,000 short. She looked at the piano again as she arranged wine glasses on a nearby table. Her grandmother had taught her to play when she was little, back in their small apartment in Queens. Those were simpler times when the biggest worry was whether she'd practiced enough for her weekly lesson. Grandma Rosa used to say that music was like magic. It could take you anywhere and make you feel anything. But that was before life got complicated, before her parents divorced and her mom started working 3 jobs, before Diego got sick and every spare dollar went to medical bills. The piano lessons stopped, and slowly, Maria convinced herself that music was just a childhood dream that didn't fit in the real world. The restaurant's front door chimed, and Maria looked up to see Vincent, crosswalking in with 3 other men in expensive suits. She recognized him immediately from the business magazines at the newsstand. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his early 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. Vincent Cross was known for being unpredictable. The stories about him were legendary in business circles. He once hired a janitor as a vice president because the man suggested a brilliant cost-saving idea. Another time he gave a homeless veteran a job and an apartment after a 5-minute conversation on the street. People said he had a gift for seeing potential where others saw nothing. As Maria watched the hostess lead Vincent's group to the private dining room, she felt a strange flutter in her stomach. Maybe it was just nerves from serving someone so important, or maybe it was something else entirely. The evening rush started picking up, and Maria found herself moving between tables like a dancer, balancing plates and taking orders with practiced ease. She'd gotten good at reading people over the months. The couple at table 7 were on their first date and barely touching their food. The businessman at table 12 was stressed about something and kept checking his phone. The elderly woman by the window was celebrating something special, judging by the way she smiled every time she looked at her dessert. Around 9 o'clock, things started to calm down. Most of the dinner crowd had left, and only a few tables remained, occupied. Maria was refilling water glasses when she noticed the soft melody drifting through her mind. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece her grandmother had taught her when she was 13. She didn't realize she was humming it until she caught herself halfway through the main theme. Music had a way of sneaking up on her like that. Sometimes, when she was stressed about Diego's medical bills or exhausted from working double shifts, a melody would just appear in her head. It was like her brain's way of giving her a break from reality, even if just for a moment. The humming helped her focus as she moved through her tasks. There was something soothing about the familiar notes, the way they flowed from one to the next like water. Her grandmother used to say that this particular piece was like a conversation between the heart and the mind, full of questions and answers that only music could express. Maria was so lost in the melody that she didn't notice when the conversation in the private dining room grew quieter. She didn't see Vincent Cross tilt his head slightly, his experienced ears picking up the complex, musical phrase she was unconsciously creating. She had no idea that her simple humming was about to change everything. As she approached the private dining room to check if they needed anything, Maria could hear bits of their conversation through the partially open door. They were talking about acquisitions and market strategies, the kind of business language that usually went right over her head. But something made her pause for just a second longer than usual. Vincent Cross was in the middle of explaining something about innovation and finding talent in unexpected places when his voice trailed off. He'd heard something that caught his attention completely. The young woman serving tables was humming a piece that most people couldn't even identify, let alone reproduce with such accuracy and feeling. Maria pushed through the dining room door with a pitcher of water, completely unaware that she'd just walked into a moment that would define the rest of her life. She approached their table with her usual professional smile, ready to refill their glasses and disappear back into the background where she felt safe. But Vincent Cross was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't the usual polite acknowledgement she got from customers. There was something more intense in his gaze, like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. The three other men at the table were still discussing quarterly projections, but Vincent had gone completely quiet. He was studying Maria the way someone might examine a painting in a museum, looking for details that others might miss. Maria felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny. Had she done something wrong? Was her humming too loud? She'd been so careful to keep it quiet, just loud enough to calm her own nerves but not disturb the customers. Maybe she'd crossed a line without realizing it. She finished refilling their water glasses in silence, preparing to excuse herself and get back to work. But as she turned to leave, Vincent Cross cleared his throat softly. The sound made her freeze. In place, her heart suddenly beating faster for reasons she couldn't explain. What happened next would be something Maria would remember for the rest of her life, though in that moment she had no idea she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to either fall or learn to fly. The silence in the private dining room stretched for what felt like forever. Maria stood frozen with the water pitcher in her hands, watching as Vincent Cross studied her face with those sharp, calculating eyes. The other three businessmen had stopped talking about their quarterly reports and were now looking back and forth between Vincent and Maria, clearly confused about what was happening. "Excuse me, miss," Vincent said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "That melody you were humming just now. Where did you learn it?" Maria's heart jumped into her throat. She'd been caught. After months of being invisible, of blending into the background like good waitstaff were supposed to do, she'd somehow managed to draw attention to herself in the worst possible way. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as she realized that her little habit of humming had been noticed by one of the most powerful men in the city. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, setting the water pitcher down on a nearby service table. "I didn't realize I was being loud. It won't happen again, I promise." But Vincent held up a hand to stop her apology. No, you weren't being loud at all. I'm asking because that was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It's not exactly a piece most people know, let alone hum perfectly while working." The three other men at the table exchanged glances. They clearly had no idea what Vincent was talking about, and Maria could see the impatience in their faces. They'd come here to discuss a business deal worth millions, not to chat with the help about classical music. Maria twisted her hands nervously in front of her apron. "My grandmother taught me when I was little," she said quietly. "She used to play piano at the community center before—" She stopped herself. These men didn't need to hear about her family's struggles or how her grandmother's arthritis had ended her playing days. Vincent leaned forward slightly, and Maria noticed something change in his expression. The sharp business look softened into something that looked almost like curiosity, maybe even kindness. "Your grandmother had excellent taste. That's one of Chopin's most challenging pieces. Did she teach you to play it?" "Yes, sir. But that was a long time ago." Maria glanced toward the main dining room, hoping her manager wouldn't notice she'd been standing in one place for too long. Tips depended on quick service and staying invisible. Conversations with customers, especially important ones, were generally discouraged unless absolutely necessary. One of the businessmen, a heavy-set man with a gold watch, cleared his throat impatiently. "Vincent, perhaps we could get back to the acquisition details. The lawyers are expecting our response by tomorrow morning." But Vincent didn't seem to hear him. He was still looking at Maria with that intense focus that made her feel like he could see right through her. "How long has it been since you played?" "About 8 years, Maria admitted. She didn't mention that the last time she'd touched a piano was at her grandmother's funeral, when the family had asked her to play Rosa's favorite song during the service. That day, her fingers had moved across the keys like they had a memory of their own, even though she hadn't practiced in months. 8 years, Vincent repeated, as if he was doing some kind of calculation in his head. "And you still remember the pieces well enough to hum them note perfect while multitasking? That's remarkable." Maria didn't know what to say to that. In her world, remembering music wasn't remarkable. It was just something that happened. The melodies lived in her head like old friends, popping up when she needed comfort or distraction. She'd never thought of it as special, just as something that made the long shifts more bearable. The businessman with the gold watch was getting more agitated. "Vincent, we really need to focus here. The Seattle office is waiting for our decision. And, tell me something," Vincent interrupted, completely ignoring his colleague's protests. "Do you ever miss it? Playing, I mean." The question hit Maria like a punch to the stomach. Did she miss it? She missed it every single day. She missed the way her fingers used to dance across the keys, the way music could make her forget about everything else in the world. She missed the feeling of bringing something beautiful to life, of taking the black dots on a page and turning them into something that could make people cry, or smile, or remember things they'd forgotten. But missing something, and being able to do something about it, were two completely different things. Piano lessons cost money. Pianos cost money. Time to practice cost money, because every hour spent on music was an hour not spent earning tips or working her second job at the grocery store. "Sometimes," she said simply, because the truth was too complicated to explain to a stranger, even a famous one. Vincent nodded like he understood something she hadn't even said. Then he looked over at the beautiful grand piano sitting in the corner of the restaurant. It was a Steinway, probably worth more than Maria made in 2 years. She'd walked past it hundreds of times, always wondering what it would feel like to play something so perfect, so well maintained. "That piano over there," Vincent said, pointing toward the corner. "It's been sitting there for decoration for months. Giuseppe told me earlier that nobody ever plays it. He just keeps it tuned because he likes the way it looks." Maria followed his gaze to the instrument. Even from across the room, she could see how the light from the chandeliers reflected off its polished surface. It was beautiful, elegant, and completely out of reach for someone like her. "It seems like a waste," Vincent continued, "having such a beautiful instrument just sitting there silent, when there's someone right here who could bring it to life." The other businessmen were starting to look seriously annoyed now. The man with the gold watch was tapping his fingers on the table, and another one was checking his phone with obvious frustration. They'd come here to discuss market shares and profit margins, not to listen to their boss chat with a waitress about music. But Vincent seemed completely oblivious to their irritation. He was looking at Maria with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something calculating about it, but not in a cold way. More like he was solving a puzzle or working out a complex problem in his head. "I have an idea," he said suddenly, and Maria felt her stomach drop. In her experience, when rich people had ideas that involved service workers, those ideas usually didn't end well for the service workers. Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Maria watched in horror as he counted out several bills and set them on the table. She couldn't see the denominations from where she was standing, but there were definitely a lot of them. "I'll make you a deal," Vincent said, his voice taking on a tone that was both playful and completely serious. "I bet you $5,000 that you can't play that Chopin piece on the piano over there. Right now, in front of everyone." The entire room went dead silent. Maria felt like the floor had just disappeared from under her feet. $5,000. That was more money than she made in 3 months of double shifts. That was enough to cover Diego's medication for half a year, maybe more. But it was also impossible. She couldn't just abandon her tables to play piano for a bunch of strangers. She'd get fired on the spot. And what if she'd forgotten how to play? What if her fingers didn't remember what her mind thought they remembered? What if she made a fool of herself in front of one of the most important men in the city? "Sir, I can't just," she started to say, but Vincent held up his hand again. $5,000, he repeated, and this time his voice carried across the entire restaurant. Other diners were starting to turn and look in their direction. "All you have to do is play one song." Maria stared at the money on the table, her mind racing. $5,000 could change everything. But could she really risk everything she had for a chance at something that seemed too good to be true? Maria stared at the stack of money on the table, her mind spinning like a broken record. $5,000. The number kept echoing in her head, louder than the soft jazz music playing from the restaurant's speakers. That amount could pay for Diego's heart medication for months. It could give her family breathing room they hadn't had in years. But the piano seemed impossibly far away, even though it was only 30 feet across the dining room. It might as well have been on the... Maria hadn't played in front of anyone except her family since she was 15. The thought of sitting at that beautiful Steinway with dozens of strangers watching made her hands shake. "I don't think I can," she whispered, looking down at her worn work shoes. "I haven't played in so long, and I'm working, and my manager..." Your manager won't say a word," Vincent interrupted gently. "I've already spoken with Giuseppe. He's curious to hear his piano played by someone who actually knows music." Maria looked up in surprise. When had he talked to Giuseppe? She hadn't seen him leave the table. But then again, men like Vincent Cross had ways of making things happen that ordinary people never noticed. The entire restaurant had grown quiet now. Word was spreading from table to table about the strange bet happening in the corner. Maria could feel dozens of eyes on her, and her face burned with embarrassment. Some diners had even stopped eating to watch the drama unfold. At table 12, an elderly couple was whispering to each other, the woman gesturing toward Maria with barely contained excitement. Near the window, a group of college students had put down their phones to pay attention to real life for once. Even the busboy had stopped clearing dishes and was pretending to arrange silverware while listening to every word. "What if I messy up?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible. "What if I've forgotten how to play? I could embarrass myself in front of everyone." Vincent's expression softened. For a moment, the sharp businessman disappeared, and Maria saw something almost fatherly in his eyes. "Let me tell you a secret," he said, leaning forward. "The people who are most afraid of failing are usually the ones with the most talent to lose. Mediocre people don't worry about embarrassing themselves because they have nothing special to protect." His words hit her harder than she expected. Was that what she'd been doing all these years? Protecting herself from failure by never trying? She thought about her grandmother Rosa, who used to say that music was like a bird in a cage. It could only fly if you were brave enough to open the door. But what if... Maria started to say. "No more what ifs," Vincent said firmly. "I've made my offer. $5,000 for one song. 3 minutes of your life that could change everything. The question is, are you going to let fear make this decision for you?" Maria looked around the restaurant again. She saw Giuseppe standing by the kitchen door, his arms crossed but his face curious rather than angry. She saw her coworker Lisa covering her abandoned tables with the encouraging nod. She saw faces full of anticipation, not judgment. And then she thought about Diego, lying in his hospital bed last week after his latest episode, trying to act brave, even though she could see the fear in his eyes. He never complained about the medical bills or the way they'd turned their lives upside down. He just kept fighting day after day because he believed things would get better. Maybe it was time for her to be as brave as her little brother. "Okay," she said suddenly, the word popping out before she could stop it. "I'll do it." A murmur of excitement rippled through the restaurant. Vincent smiled, not the calculating businessman smile, but something genuine and warm. "Excellent. Take your time. There's no rush." But Maria knew that if she waited any longer, she'd lose her nerve. Completely. Her legs felt like jelly as she walked across the dining room toward the piano, every step echoing in the sudden quiet. The Steinway looked even more intimidating up close, its black surface so polished she could see her reflection in it. She sat down on the velvet bench and immediately felt out of place. Her polyester work uniform looked cheap against the elegant instrument. Her hands, dry from constant hand-washing and cleaning, felt rough against the smooth keys. For a second, she wondered if this was all a terrible mistake. Then she closed her eyes and let her fingers find middle C. The note rang out pure and clear, and suddenly Maria wasn't in the restaurant anymore. She was 13 years old again, sitting next to Grandma Rosa on the old upright piano in their Queens apartment. She could smell her grandmother's lavender perfume and hear her gentle voice saying, "Music isn't about perfect technique, mija. It's about telling the truth with your heart." Maria's right hand found the opening notes of the nocturne, and muscle memory took over. Her fingers remembered exactly where to go, even after 8 years of silence. The melody began softly, almost hesitantly, like someone sharing a secret they weren't sure they should tell. But as the first phrase developed, Maria felt something magical happening. The notes weren't just sounds anymore. They were colors and emotions and memories all flowing together. She could feel her grandmother's presence in the music, guiding her hands like she had all those years ago. The restaurant had become completely silent. Not the awkward quiet of people trying not to listen, but the profound silence of people afraid to breathe because they might miss something beautiful. Maria didn't notice. She was lost in the music now, her fingers dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. The nocturne was a piece about longing and hope, about dreams deferred but not forgotten. As Maria played, she poured 8 years of suppressed emotion into every note. The late nights working double shifts, the worry about Diego's health, the dreams of music school she'd given up. It all came flowing out through Chopin's timeless melody. Halfway through the piece, something unexpected happened. Maria began to improvise. She'd never done this before, not even as a child, but the music seemed to demand it. She started weaving jazz harmonies into Chopin's classical structure, adding her own voice to the conversation the composer had started over a century ago. Her left hand found a walking bass line that shouldn't have worked with the classical melody, but somehow did. Her right hand began to syncopate certain phrases, giving them a contemporary feel that made the old music sound fresh and alive. It was like she was having a musical conversation with her grandmother across time, blending the traditional techniques Rosa had taught her with the modern sounds she'd absorbed from years of background music in restaurants and stores. The transformation was remarkable. What had started as a faithful reproduction of a classical piece was becoming something entirely new, a fusion of old and new formal training and street wisdom, European elegance, and American soul. Maria had no idea that several people in the restaurant were quietly recording with their phones. She didn't know that Giuseppe had tears in his eyes or that Vincent was staring at her with an expression of complete amazement. She was aware only of the music flowing through her, 8 years of silence breaking open like a dam bursting after a long drought. As she approached the final section of the piece, Maria made another spontaneous decision. Instead of ending with Chopin's gentle conclusion, she began to transition into something else entirely. A hymn her grandmother used to play at church, transformed into something that bridged the gap between sacred and secular, between the concert hall and the street corner. The music soared and dipped, whispered and sang, carrying everyone in the restaurant on an emotional journey they hadn't expected when they'd come in for dinner. And Maria, lost in the flow of creation, had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The final note hung in the air like a prayer, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers and settling into the hearts of everyone in the restaurant. Maria kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, her hands still resting on the keys, not quite ready to return to reality. In that silence, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice whispering, "Beautiful, mija. Just beautiful." Then the silence shattered. The applause started with Vincent slow and deliberate, his hands coming together with genuine appreciation. But within seconds it spread like wildfire through the restaurant. The elderly couple at table 12 were clapping so enthusiastically that the woman's bracelet jangled with each movement. The college students near the window had put down their phones entirely. their faces lit up with wonder that something so beautiful could happen in real life. But it wasn't just polite restaurant applause. This was something deeper, more emotional. Maria opened her eyes to see the strangest thing. People were crying. The businessman who'd been impatiently checking his phone throughout Vincent's conversation was wiping his eyes with his napkin. A woman at the bar had her hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her cheeks. Giuseppe emerged from behind the kitchen counter, his usually stern face soft with amazement. In 30 years of running the restaurant, he'd never heard his piano played like that. He'd bought the Steinway partly for decoration, and partly because he'd always dreamed that someone would make music with it. Tonight, that dream had finally come true. "Brava!" Giuseppe called out in his thick Italian accent, his voice carrying over the applause. "Brava, Bella. That was magnifico." Maria stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The applause continued, growing louder instead of fading. She looked around the restaurant in disbelief. These weren't people being polite to a waitress who'd made a fool of herself. These were people who'd just experienced something magical. Woman at table 6 was telling her companion, "I've been to Carnegie Hall, but I've never heard anything like that." Another diner was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to capture the moment in words that could never really describe what had just happened. Vincent was still applauding, but his expression had changed completely. The playful businessman who'd made the bet was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely moved. When their eyes met across the room, Maria saw something in his face that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't just surprise or even admiration. It was recognition, as if he'd seen something in her performance that even she didn't fully understand. "That," he said, his voice carrying across the now quieting restaurant, "was extraordinary." Maria walked back toward the private dining room, on unsteady legs, still processing what had just happened. The last 10 minutes felt like a dream, like something that had happened to someone else. But the feeling in her fingertips was real, the muscle memory awakening after years of sleep. And the faces around her, faces full of joy and wonder, those were real too. Vincent's 3 business associates were staring at her with expressions of complete bewilderment. They'd come here to discuss market projections and acquisition strategies, not to witness a musical miracle. The man with the gold watch looked like he'd just seen a unicorn walk through the dining room. "I've never seen anything like that," one of them mumbled. Where did that come from?" But Vincent was focused entirely on Maria as she approached their table. He stood up, which made her feel even more self-conscious. Men like Vincent Cross didn't stand up for waitresses no matter how well they played piano. "That wasn't just playing," he said quietly, his voice full of something that sounded almost like awe. "That was composing, in real time. You took Chopin and made it your own, then seamlessly blended it with something completely different. Where did you learn to do that?" Maria shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. "I didn't learn it anywhere. It felt right. The music wanted to go somewhere else, so I followed it." Vincent exchanged glances with his associates, who were clearly out of their depth in this conversation. "You followed it," he repeated slowly. "Do you understand how rare that is? Most trained musicians spend years learning to improvise like that, and even then, they can't do it with that kind of emotional intelligence." "I don't know about any of that," Maria said honestly. "I just played what I felt, and that was the truth." She couldn't explain what had happened at the piano any more than she could explain why her heart beat, or why flowers bloomed. It had simply felt as natural as breathing, like coming home after a long journey to a place she'd almost forgotten existed. Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the stack of bills he'd promised. But instead of just handing them to her, he paused, studying her face one more time. "Before I give you this," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Maria's stomach clenched. Was he going to take back the bet? Had she somehow failed to meet his expectations? The money was right there, enough to solve so many of her family's problems, but maybe it had been too good to be true. "What you just did," Vincent continued, That wasn't the performance of someone who used to play piano as a hobby. That was the performance of someone with serious professional-level talent. The kind of talent that most people spend their entire lives trying to develop. He paused, looking directly into her eyes. So, here's my question. What are you doing working as a waitress when you could be doing that? The question hit Maria like a physical blow. She'd asked herself the same thing 1,000 times over the years, usually late at night when she was too tired to keep the dreams locked away. But the answer was always the same, always practical, always rooted in the harsh reality of bills and responsibilities. Because talent doesn't pay for my brother's medication, she said simply. Because dreams don't keep the lights on, because the world has plenty of musicians who can't make a living, and my family needs me to be reliable, not artistic. Vincent nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. What if I told you that wasn't true? What if I told you there was a way to use that talent to solve your family's problems instead of ignoring it? Maria's heart started racing again, but this time it wasn't from performance adrenaline. It was from something that felt dangerously like hope. What do you mean? Vincent glanced at his associates, who were still looking completely lost. Then, back at Maria. What I mean is that I didn't come here tonight just for a business dinner. I've been looking for someone exactly like you for months, and I had no idea I'd find them serving tables at my favorite restaurant. He handed her the stack of bills but kept talking as she took the money with trembling hands. That bet wasn't really about whether you could play piano. It was about whether you had the courage to show the world who you really are. And now that I know you do. Vincent paused, and Maria realized that everyone in the restaurant had gone quiet again, straining to hear what he would say next. Even the kitchen staff had gathered by the service window, sensing that something important was happening. Now that I know you do, Vincent continued, I have a proposition for you. One that could change not just your life, but the lives of thousands of other people who have talent, but no opportunity. Maria gripped the money tighter, her mind reeling. 5 minutes ago, she'd been worried about getting fired for abandoning her tables. Now she was standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the city, and he was talking about changing her life. What kind of proposition? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent gestured toward an empty chair at their table, and Maria sat down with shaky legs, still clutching the $5,000. Her uniform felt even more out of place now, surrounded by men in $1,000 suits. But something in Vincent's expression made her feel less like an outsider and more like an equal. For the past 2 years, Vincent began, my company has been developing something revolutionary. We're creating a platform that connects undiscovered musical talent with people who need it most. Think of it as a bridge between the conservatory and the street corner, between classical training and real-world application. Maria tried to follow what he was saying, but the business language was making her head spin. She was still processing the fact that she'd just performed in front of 50 strangers and lived to tell about it. Vincent seemed to notice her confusion and smiled. Let me put it in simpler terms. We're building a program that finds people, like you, people with incredible natural talent who never got the chance to develop it properly. And we're giving them opportunities to use that talent in ways that actually pay the bills. He pulled out his phone and showed her a sleek app interface. This isn't about creating more struggling artists. This is about creating a new kind of music professional. Someone who can teach kids in underserved communities. Someone who can provide music therapy in hospitals. Someone who can bring beauty into places where it's desperately needed. Maria stared at the screen, trying to understand what this had to do with her. But I'm not qualified for any of those things. I don't have a degree or certifications or... You just proved your qualifications in front of this entire restaurant, Vincent interrupted gently. What you did tonight showed more musical intelligence than most people develop in 4 years of college. You took a classical piece, understood its emotional core, and transformed it into something completely personal. That's not something you can teach in a classroom. One of Vincent's associates, the man with the gold watch, leaned forward. Vincent, are you seriously considering... I'm not considering anything, Vincent said firmly. I'm offering something. He turned back to Maria. I want you to be the face of our new program, Director of Community Music Outreach. Starting salary is $80,000 a year, plus benefits, plus a budget to hire and train other musicians who are in situations similar to yours. The number hit Maria like a lightning bolt. $80,000. That was more than she made, in 2 years working double shifts. That was enough to pay for Diego's surgery, to move her family to a better neighborhood, to finally stop counting every penny and living in constant fear of the next medical bill. But it was also impossible. People like her didn't become directors of anything. They didn't get offered jobs by billionaires based on one piano performance. Things like this happened in movies, not in real life. I don't understand, she said slowly. Why me? You could hire someone with actual credentials, someone who's studied music business or nonprofit management or whatever. Why would you want a waitress who hasn't played piano in 8 years? Vincent leaned back in his chair, and for a moment he looked almost sad. Because someone with credentials wouldn't understand what it feels like to have talent locked away by circumstances. They wouldn't know how to connect with a teenager in East Harlem who's given up on music because their family can't afford lessons. They wouldn't recognize the spark in a single mother who hums while she works 3 jobs to support her kids. He gestured toward the piano where she'd just performed. What you did tonight wasn't just playing music. You told a story about resilience, about dreams deferred but not destroyed. That's exactly what our program needs. Someone who can speak from experience about turning obstacles into opportunities. Maria felt tears starting to form in her eyes. But what if I fail? What if I'm not smart enough or educated enough? What if I let you down? Let me tell you something I've learned in 20 years of business, Vincent said. The people who worry about failing are usually the ones who care most about succeeding. And caring is more valuable than any degree or certification. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. This is my direct number. I want you to think about this offer over the weekend. Talk to your family. Ask yourself what your grandmother would want you to do. Then call me Monday morning with your answer. Maria took the card with trembling fingers. The company logo was simple but elegant. Crosstech Innovations. On the back, Vincent had written a salary figure that made her dizzy just looking at it. There's one more thing, Vincent said, and his voice took on a more serious tone. This isn't charity. I'm not offering you this job because I feel sorry for you or because I want to play the generous billionaire. I'm offering it because my company needs what you have. We've been looking for the right person to lead this initiative for months, and every candidate we interviewed was missing something essential. What were they missing? Maria asked. Heart, Vincent said simply. They understood music theory, and business models and marketing strategies. But they didn't understand what it feels like to have music living inside you while the world tells you it's not practical. They couldn't bridge the gap between the conservatory and the corner store, between formal training and raw talent. Giuseppe appeared at their table, his face still glowing with pride. Scusi, but I had to come tell you. In 30 years I never heard my piano sing like that. Whatever this gentleman is offering you, Bella, you should say yes. The world needs to hear your music. Maria looked around the restaurant one more time. The other diners were still talking about her performance. She could hear fragments of conversation. Incredible. Where did she come from? Gave me chills. A few people were even asking Giuseppe if she performed regularly, if they could come back to hear her play again. I need to ask you something, Maria said to Vincent. If I take this job, would I still get to perform? Or would it just be administrative work? Vincent's smile was answer enough, but he explained anyway. Performance would be a huge part of the job. You'd be demonstrating techniques, inspiring other musicians, showing communities what's possible. Plus, we'd want you to do regular concerts, not in stuffy concert halls, but in schools and community centers and places where people need hope. Maria thought about Diego, probably asleep in their tiny apartment right now, trusting that somehow things would work out. She thought about her grandmother Rosa, who used to say that music was God's way of reminding people that beauty existed even in the hardest times. Can I ask you one more thing? She said. How did you know? How did you know I could play like that just from hearing me hum? Vincent chuckled. Honestly, I didn't know for certain, but I've learned to recognize hunger when I see it. You had the look of someone who was starving for the chance to do what they were meant to do. The humming was just confirmation. He stood up and extended his hand. Think about it over the weekend. But remember, your grandmother didn't teach you to play so you could hide that gift forever. She taught you because she knew someday someone would need to hear exactly what you played tonight. As Maria shook his hand, she realized that everything had changed in the span of 30 minutes. She'd walked into this evening as a waitress trying to make rent. She was walking out as someone who'd been offered a chance to change not just her own life, but the lives of countless other people. The money in her pocket felt different now. Not like the end goal, but like the beginning of something much bigger. And for the first time in years, Maria allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, dreams could pay the bills after all. Outside, the city lights sparkled like the keys of a giant piano, and Maria could almost hear her grandmother's voice on the wind whispering, "Play, Misha. The world is waiting to hear your song."